Welcome back. In our last lecture, we talked about what the classical world thought about the Celts, so we were basing our discussion very much on written texts. Today we're going to shift gears completely. We will look not at written texts, but at material objects. We'll see what archaeology can tell us about the Celts. And we'll see that the story is richer, but also much more complicated than scholars used to think. One of the key things we need to think about in this lecture is the relationship between the written texts that we talked about in the last lecture and the physical artifacts we'll be talking about in this lecture. Ideally, texts and objects will work together to tell a more complete story than either kind of evidence would do all by itself. Many times, in fact, this is just what happens. But we always have to be somewhat cautious because sometimes written texts can be so suggestive that scholars interpret material objects in light of those texts and not in their own terms. That has happened more than once in the history of archaeology. It's important not to start reasoning in a circle. But with that very general caution in mind, we can proceed. We need to start by saying a few very basic things about archaeology. Archaeology has changed a lot in the past half-century or so. But a lot of the earlier models that archaeology started out with have lingered in the popular understanding and even in the work of scholars from other fields. Let me lay out some older archaeological thinking, and then I'll explain how it has changed. These changes have had a revolutionary impact on our understanding of the Celts. Archaeologists have a tradition of identifying what they call cultures. What they really mean by this is material cultures, that is, groups of artifacts, because that is all that archaeologists can know about for certain. They infer all sorts of other things about social practices and beliefs, but all they really have are the actual artifacts they discover. So archaeologists identify cultures based on finding similar artifacts in a particular region, and they usually name them after the most important site where those artifacts were found. The implicit idea is that this site is a kind of epicenter of a particular group of people that share a common identity expressed in this material culture. Of course, there's the obvious danger that we might be considering a site to be more important than it actually was just because we've happened to find it. Perhaps other, more consequential sites have simply not come to light. This model of identifying cultures by their artifacts has other obvious limitations. Artifacts cannot tell us what language people spoke. They can't tell us how the people who used the artifacts thought about themselves or what they called themselves. And artifacts also don't come in neat packages. It used to be thought that cultures came in neatly packaged bundles of artifacts. People who used this kind of pot also wore this kind of brooch and fought with this kind of sword. Nowadays, archaeologists realize that there are actually very complicated distribution maps for different kinds of artifacts. Different kinds of pots or brooches or weapons can overlap with each other on a map. People don't choose their pots specifically to stake a claim to their own ethnic identity. People make decisions about what objects they will use and what they will wear on the micro level. And all you get is a broad picture of what sorts of objects were popular in which times and places. That's a lot of caveats, but it's important to set out some of these basic assumptions before we start talking about the artifacts themselves. First, let's ask a basic question. Why does all of this matter with regard to the Celts? It matters because the older model of archaeology helped to create the model of the Celts as a distinct ethnic group that spread out from Central Europe and took over large sections of the European continent. Archaeologists in the 19th century discovered artifacts that they associated with the classical texts about the Celts, and they assumed that the people who owned and used these objects were the same people they read about in the classical texts. That model prevailed until the last few decades, and you can still see it in popular books about the Celts and even in textbooks to this very day. I'll talk a bit more about how this archaeological model for the Celts arose towards the end of this course. But in this lecture, I want to focus more on what the archaeologists actually found. We can debate the models that we use to talk about these artifacts, but they are still one of the most important sources we have for understanding the early Celts. And there is no doubt whatsoever that something very interesting was going on in Central Europe during the Iron Age. So let's look at the old model first. The traditional story, in fact, the one that I learned when I studied the Celts as an undergraduate, is that the Celts arose in Central Europe in the middle of the first millennium BC in association with two cultures that appeared one after the other, both named for the sites of important archaeological finds. The first site was at Hallstatt in western Austria, and the second site was at Latten in western Switzerland. So let's talk first about the Hallstatt culture, which flourished from roughly 1200 to 475 BC. As I said, Hallstatt is in western Austria, which is also referred to as Upper Austria. Starting in the early 19th century, about 1,000 graves were excavated at Hallstatt, dating from the early Iron Age. There were thousands of artifacts in these graves, including weapons and imported Mediterranean vessels. Some of these objects had traveled hundreds of miles before being buried at Hallstatt. We are clearly looking at a flourishing system of long-distance trade. Now, were the people buried in these graves Celts? Scholars in the 19th century assumed that they were, but we can't be sure. The Hallstatt culture probably actually covered areas that included both Celtic speakers and non-Celtic speakers. But some scholars have proposed a connection between the Celts and the excellent metalwork found in the graves, since the Celts were famous for being excellent metalsmiths, at least in the classical texts that have come down to us. It's possible that this is a case of circular reasoning that I warned about. But at any rate, the metalwork is truly spectacular, and it indicates a high level of professional sophistication. And this means that there were people rich enough to pay for all that expertise. And that, in turn, means that we are looking at a highly stratified society with far-flung economic ties around Europe and even beyond. You can see this in another very characteristic feature of this period, the hill fort. There are dozens of these large fortifications across Central Europe, and they're often associated with princely graves. Archaeologists have theorized that the princely graves probably contain the remains of the local strongmen who built and maintained the hill forts, and this seems a reasonable working hypothesis. The hill forts tell us that this society was developing local power centers in which hundreds or even thousands of people could gather. So this was becoming a quite sophisticated society. The princely graves associated with these hill forts are spectacular, of course, and whole museums have been built around them. There is a museum in Eberdingen, Germany, called the Keltenmuseum, or the Celtic Museum. And to make the Celtic connection even clearer, the address of the museum is Keltenstraße 2, or 2 Celtic Street. So they are really betting on an identity between the Celts and the people who lived here. The grave that gave rise to the museum, which was discovered at nearby Hochdorf in 1977, dates from the Hallstatt D level, which is the latest level of the Hallstatt culture, dating to around 530 BC. Inside the burial chamber, which has been reconstructed in the museum, there was a man about 6 foot 2 inches in height, which would have been an enormous height at the time. This might remind us of the reports in the classical sources that the Celts were very large in stature. He was about age 40, and he was resting on a wheeled couch of bronze, and he was obviously very wealthy because he was buried with a large collection of grave goods. I want to point out 2 objects in particular. He had golden shoes, and he also had a huge cauldron with 3 lions for decoration. The cauldron originally held 100 gallons of mead, or fermented honey, which would have been the alcoholic beverage of choice in this part of the world at that time. So the afterlife was going to be one long party for this particular prince. What else can we know for sure about this prince? Not very much. There was a substantial village nearby. We can guess that he was probably its chief, but we can't really be sure that he was a Celt because we can't know what language he spoke. At some point around 500 to 450 BC, the Hallstatt culture seems to have been disrupted, and the hill forts were largely abandoned. We see new kinds of artifacts coming in, and we don't know exactly why. This could have been due to migrations of peoples or to political troubles within the society itself. So we can't be sure whether the Hallstatt people were replaced by entirely new people or whether we just see the descendants of the same people living in a new way. And again, we don't know just from looking at the artifacts what language the people spoke. But the thing that is most noteworthy about the new culture, which was named after a site called La Tène in Switzerland, where some of its characteristic artifacts were found, is that it produced some spectacular art that has become particularly associated with the Celts, though this poses a lot of problems that we'll talk about in detail later on. Before I talk about the art, I want to make a point about trade. The La Tène people seem to have traded even more with the Mediterranean than the Hallstatt people, so they must have been even more prosperous and well-connected. We can see this from another princely burial, but this time it's a princess rather than a prince. A grave was found at Vix in eastern France from around 500 BC, overlapping with the end of Hallstatt. And in the grave was an enormous Greek wine vessel made of bronze. It held 290 gallons, the largest such vessel ever found. Think about that for a moment. 290 gallons of wine is a lot of wine, and it presupposes a fairly sophisticated social structure, since this princess was not going to drink all that wine by herself. This artifact shows the connections of these people with the Mediterranean world. Nearby were the remains of a palace complex. This was obviously an important economic and political center. But these people were not just importing metal objects. They were making plenty of their own. Over 2,500 metal objects were found at the La Tène site, most with some military connection. More than 166 swords were found, most of which were never used. So we're probably looking here at some sort of ritual functions for the swords. Many of the swords were elaborately decorated with the characteristic patterns of this art style. It's a fair bet that a society that produced elaborate ritual swords also used more practically oriented swords a lot, so we're probably looking at a highly militarized society, or at least a society where military matters were associated with the elite. You also see a lot of torques, which are gold neckbands that were worn by both men and women. They were open at the back with two elaborate terminals. You would put on a torque by pulling one terminal forward to make a wider gap and then slip it around your neck. Some of them are beautifully made out of twisted gold wire. The word torque is a reference to the twisting. Many of these torques were so heavy that they could probably only have been worn by a very large man. A lot of classical commentators on the Celts remarked on the torques that they wore, and the famous sculpture of the so-called dying Gaul, which, as we saw in a previous lecture, was actually a dying Galatian, shows the man wearing a torque. So the archaeology confirms that the written sources were accurate when they reported that the people of Central Europe had a penchant for this rather dramatic style of jewelry. And thus, this mention of the torques brings me to a very important point I want to stress. Although I have been casting doubt on some of the broad generalizations in the old story of the Celts, there are quite a lot of close connections between the written texts and the objects that archaeologists dug out of the ground. It's easy to see why these 19th century scholars connected the dots between the artifacts that they were finding and the people the classical authors described. In fact, in addition to the torques, there are other important artifacts that the sources associate with the Celts. I want to spend some time now talking about one of the most interesting artifacts associated with the Celts. It is a special bronze or copper trumpet called the carnix, which comes from a Gaulish word meaning antler or horn. It's related to the Latin word for horn that gives us our word cornucopia, or horn of plenty. The carnix was a very long tube that you played vertically, and it had an animal head at the business end of the trumpet, often a boar's head. One of the most famous examples comes from Tintignac in the Limousin region of France, where pieces of 7 dismantled carnices, that's the plural of carnix, were found in a hoard. Archaeologists figured out from piecing the fragments together that the animal heads actually included large metal sheets in the shape of ears, and these were meant to help amplify the sound of the trumpets. As one scholar put it, they would act like loudspeakers when the trumpet was blown. Another famous carnix is the one found at Deskford in northeast Scotland. It's impressive enough now with its opening in the shape of a roaring boar. When the trumpet was first found, the boar had a movable wooden tongue. Perhaps the playing of the trumpet actually caused the tongue to move, as if the boar were speaking or roaring or whatever boars do. And the eyes were probably originally made of brightly colored enamel. This would have been a very impressive sight as well as sound. But when were these special trumpets played? The classical sources tell us that the Celts were famous for their battlefield music, which was loud and in your face, and a huge part of that brashness was due to the carnix. Museum specialists have duplicated the carnix with modern materials so that they could test it out. It is, after all, a very long, very cool war trumpet. Why would you not want to know what it sounded like? The reconstructed sound of the carnix is like nothing else on Earth, except perhaps for a vuvuzela, only even louder. Why was the carnix so effective? Keep in mind that pre-modern warfare was largely a game of morale. The most important thing was really scaring your enemy into breaking and running. So being intimidating was very helpful, and loud music can do this. Would it have actually deterred an enemy from attacking? Well, possibly. Trumpets have been used in warfare for thousands of years. Think about the Israelites blowing trumpets to bring down the walls of Jericho. But the classical sources also mention that these carnices were used in Druid ceremonies. And judging from the places they have been found, they certainly seem to have been associated with high status. Some have been found in princely graves, and others in places with some sort of ritual function, such as a lake where objects of high prestige, like swords, were ritually deposited. So the people who produced the carnix obviously valued it highly. The carnix was found all over Central Europe for a very long period of time, probably from about 300 BC to 300 AD. So it's a very long-lived phenomenon. But it's important to keep in mind that the Celts had no monopoly over this particular form of rather aggressive music. The carnix was used in regions that were never Celtic-speaking, as far as we know, such as northern and southeastern Europe. There are even carved depictions of carnix players from India. So the Celts can't claim exclusive credit for the carnix. They used it because it suited their purposes, not because there was anything specifically Celtic about it. But they sure did make an impression on the Greek and Roman authors who wrote about the Celts. The carnix is not the only artifact associated with the Celts that is not exclusive to the Celts. Torques, too, were found in areas beyond the Celtic-speaking realm, though it seems as if they had a special significance within Celtic-speaking cultures as a way to denote status. So what we see here is not a phenomenon that is exclusively Celtic, but rather one that Celts deployed in a distinctive way. I've mentioned two distinctive kinds of artifacts so far that were specifically mentioned in the classical sources, the torque and the carnix. Now I want to say a few words about another kind of artifact that is often associated with the Celts, the decorative helmet. Like the torque and the carnix, a highly decorated helmet was by definition an object associated with the elite. These helmets were found all across Europe, and they were often made in the shape of animals. For example, a helmet found at Tintignac, which is where the large number of carnices were deposited, was made in the shape of a swan. A helmet from Romania had an eagle's head with wings that actually flapped as the warrior moved. Sounds a bit silly, but it was probably meant to impress. There are animal-headed helmets depicted on the famous silver cauldron found at Gundestrup in Denmark, which I'll talk about in more detail later on. Finally, there is the famous horned helmet found in the Thames River at Waterloo Bridge. It has two big, fat, pointy horns sticking out, and delicate patterns were incised into the cap of the helmet. This was not really intended to protect the wearer in battle. It was a form of very conspicuous display. The society that produced these artifacts cared a lot about status, and they articulated that status with beautiful objects that asserted the wealth and power of their owners. Notice that both these decorated helmets and the carnices featured animal heads. In both cases, we're talking about a rather stylized version of the animal in question. Animals play a very important role in Celtic art. So let's talk a little about Celtic art in general. The first thing I should say is that the term Celtic art is a bit inexact, and scholars don't really want to use it anymore. Because as we've seen, it's hard to be sure of the ethnic identity of the people who produced it. Instead, art historians prefer to talk about the Latin style because of its association with the famous finds at Latin. So in this lecture, I'm not going to be as precise as all that. I am just going to say Celtic art and Latin art interchangeably and trust that we can all appreciate the nuances involved. So when we're talking about Latin style, what does that actually mean? The first thing to say is that this is not a static phenomenon. There are various phases of this art style, and it varies over time and space. But to anybody but an expert, the common elements seem to stand out more than the differences. One of the most important characteristics is the presence of a lot of spirals and curvilinear forms in general. This art is all about the curves, but it is also about dense, repeated patterns that look organic and yet are somehow extremely precise. This art style has lots of vaguely vegetal-looking forms that may or may not represent actual living plants. There is an almost modern emphasis on abstraction, and in fact, this art style has proved very influential in modern art. But when this art does depict figures, they tend to be rather stylized instead of realistic. This art emphasizes the essential elements of figures rather than attempting to capture them in full, in 3 dimensions. And there is a persistent fascination with animal forms, though these are often mythic-looking or at least highly stylized. This is not a naturalistic style at all. This art style was enormously popular. It spread far and wide, including eventually to Britain and parts of Ireland. As we will see when we get to Britain and Ireland in later lectures, archaeologists used to think that the Celts spread out from Central Europe and took over Britain and Ireland, bringing their art with them. But now scholars think that it was the art that traveled, not so much the people. It was kind of like a prehistoric fad. And the fad still has legs today. Many people sport tattoos that harken back to the classic art of the Latin period. One striking aspect of this art, as opposed to classical art styles, is that we find very few depictions of complete human figures. The human body does not seem to have fascinated these artists the way it did the sculptors and painters of ancient Greece and Rome. With one interesting exception, we see a number of representations of severed human heads. Keep in mind that our classical sources do note the importance of the severed head in Celtic society. But modern scholars are increasingly coming to the conclusion that there was no single way in which human heads were treated across all of the Celtic-speaking realms. Again, we will find unity in the Celtic phenomenon if we look for unity. But if we are open to diversity, we'll find that as well. So now that we've talked about this art style in some detail, I want to spend some time on one of the most impressive masterpieces that is traditionally associated with the Celts. And I say traditionally for a reason. This is the famous Gundestrup cauldron. The story of how it was discovered is rather interesting, and it certainly speaks to the role of chance in archaeology. Sometimes we find things because archaeologists very cleverly know where to look for them, but other times it's just good luck. It was a miserable day in May in 1891 in northern Jutland in Denmark, and some laborers who were digging peat had just about decided to quit work due to the bad weather when one of their shovels hit something hard. The object turned out to be a large silver cauldron containing decorated plates that were stacked inside. These plates would have been fastened to the cauldron both inside and outside. The outer plates depict various human-like figures who appear to be gods, since they're engaged in superhuman feats, and since the figures of animals that surround them are much smaller. Often the relative size of figures tells you about their relative status. This is an artistic convention that has lasted for thousands of years, apparently. The inner plates depict more complicated scenes of military life and hunting, including the image of the Carnix that I mentioned earlier. The best recent estimate of its age is that it dates to around 150 to 50 BC. The Gundestrup cauldron is magnificent, but it is highly controversial, and the controversy over the cauldron very neatly sums up the contrast between two views of the Celts: the old view of the Celts as a distinct people with a consistent cultural identity, and the new view of the Celts as a more fluid grouping of peoples who were open to lots of influences. In the past, the Gundestrup cauldron has always been classified as a Celtic object, mostly because the assumption is that the people who lived in this part of Europe had to have been Celts. But many aspects of the cauldron don't seem Celtic at all. For one thing, it has none of the abstract patterning that is so characteristic of the Latin style. Where are the intricate spirals and vegetal forms? Not there. Then there is the question of what the figures on the cauldron represent. One notable feature of the cauldron is the fact that, unlike a lot of other artifacts made in the so-called Celtic style, it does have a number of human portraits. Now, those who want to read the cauldron as a Celtic object see Celtic gods and mythological figures. The most famous of these figures is the man with antlers, who has been identified as the Celtic god of the hunt, Cernunnos. But not everyone sees these figures as Celtic gods. Some art historians who look at the cauldron see more Mediterranean influences, or even Central Asian elements in these figures. We know that the peoples in Central Europe were in contact with all of those places, so it's possible that native Central European craftsmen simply took motifs that they had come across from elsewhere and made them their own. So we can't be sure if the people who made it were Celts, but its presence all the way in Denmark testifies to the sophistication of the society that produced it and valued it. Art plays a very important role in the traditional narrative of the Celts. According to this narrative, the Celtic tradition is stamped out by the Romans everywhere in Europe, but it takes refuge largely in the British Isles and Ireland. And as we'll see in a later lecture, the Romans certainly did a lot to wipe out the inhabitants of the Celtic-speaking lands in Europe. But it is much too simple to say that Celtic art took refuge in places like Ireland. For one thing, Celtic art did not stand still, even in the places where it developed in the first place, and it was always open to outside influences, as we saw with the Gundestrup cauldron and many other artifacts. Scholars have tried to draw conclusions about the Celtic mentality from the art. These efforts are suggestive, but inconclusive. Celtic craftsmen adopted different motifs and techniques and materials because they liked them. And then the style spread because other people liked it, not because they felt some kind of genetic attraction to it. And that is actually good news for us, because whatever your ancestry may be, if you are attracted by this beautiful, mysterious, almost hypnotic art style, you can adopt it. You can wear it on a scarf or tattoo it on your skin, or just enjoy looking at pictures of the many masterpieces created in this style, both in prehistory and today. Whether the art of the La Tène period was produced by Celts or not, who cares? I think we'll keep it.